If you were here last week, you probably remember that we were talking about Palm Sunday. Last week, Jesus was entering Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. I didn't say anything about that, but a donkey is a weird animal for the so-called Messiah to ride into the capital on, isn't it? I mean, he should be on a horse or something, or chariot or something. But for people who had studied religious prophecy, as the religious elite must have, they would have understood its significance. There was a significance around the Messiah riding on the back of a donkey. It was a little obscure prophecy in the book of Zechariah. This was one of the many legends about the Messiah, and it was one of the more obscure ones, but it seems like, in this case, this so-called pretender, Jesus, the Messiah, had co-opted it. And to add insult to injury, the son of a carpenter was claiming not only to be the son of David, but also the son of God. He had entered the temple and pretty much destroyed the source of income for the religious elite. And if you read the accounts in Luke's gospel, he didn't stop there. He proceeded to publicly humiliate them. And so naturally they reached a point where they'd had enough. And so jealousy and anger and rage and fear drove these people to hatch a plot for his execution. Now, even though the edict for his death was signed by a Roman governor and it was carried out by Roman soldiers, the stories around his death, corroborated by more than just the writings of the gospel, show that Jesus was ultimately crucified because he dared to challenge the powers of his day. So, today is Saturday. Yesterday, he was being whipped, abused, spat on, and there were people in the Roman governor's courtyard calling for Jesus' death. Crucify him! Crucify him! By noon, they dragged him out to Skull Hill, the place of death outside of the city, and they'd hung him on a cross. There'd been a total solar eclipse and a major earthquake around the time he died. But after that, the city quieted down, and after all the commotion, everybody went home. And people around the city must have thought, well, that's the end of that. Indeed, his followers did think that. In the end, they ran away, they huddled together in quiet, in secret. In 3 short years, this nobody had become a somebody and then a dead somebody. So on this day after Good Friday, nobody could be faulted for thinking that he was not who he said he was, because after such a public and terrible execution, the story seems to have ground to a final, terrifying halt. And it is this knowledge that makes the Christian story and the Christian movement so intriguing. Because something happened after the crucifixion of Jesus to his followers that brought them out of hiding and into public. And you see, most religious movements die out after the death of their leader. There are only a handful of religious movements or social movements that survive the death of their leader. But the thing that separates Jesus from other movements around that time that survived was a startling claim that his followers made. They claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And they went further. They started communities because of it. In later years, they tried to compile all the stories about Jesus into the Gospels. We have them as the 4 Gospels. But more surprisingly, they held onto their stories and their claims of resurrection so defiantly that they were even killed for it. Depending on who you talk to, there are lots of people that would go to great lengths to discredit the faith movement that started because of Jesus. He couldn't have been who he said he was. He couldn't have done the things you people claim he did. He couldn't have risen from the dead. Your beliefs are preposterous, and you're deluded for even thinking them. I'll be honest. I do not have faith in Jesus because of a massive amount of scientific evidence. However, I've come to realize something, and it's one of the sparks of my faith. None of us would defend a blatant lie that we knew was a lie. Think about it. They would have never made up a story about the resurrection, come out of hiding, and then proceed to die for something that they knew was a lie. People don't die for lies that they know are lies. Allow me to go on a rabbit trail for a minute. There's a speaker that I love called Andy Stanley, and he said something at a conference a couple of years ago that just hit me in a way that I wasn't expecting. He said that of all of Jesus' followers, the one that presents us with the most evidence that Jesus was who he said he was his brother, James. All of us have brothers and sisters, or at least most of us have brothers and sisters. My daughter doesn't, but most of us have brothers and sisters. And we know that our brothers and sisters can see right through our BS. They can see right through it. James was not one of Jesus' early followers. He was his brother. It makes sense that he was skeptical about Jesus because he had grown up with him. In fact, James joined the Jesus movement after Jesus was gone. If any of us had a brother walking around claiming to be the Son of God, we would quietly distance ourselves from our nutjob brother, wouldn't we? He would become the embarrassment of the family. So for James to do an about face and become one of the followers of Jesus, one of the leaders of his movement, was very interesting. And so Andy Stanley asked us this question: what would your brother have to do to convince you that he was the Son of God? What would your brother, you know him, have to do to convince you he was the Son of God? I think rising from the dead is pretty awesome, isn't it? It's one of those things that, okay, I guess he must be. Anyway, back from the rabbit trail. It's Saturday. We're not yet on Sunday. And things seem quiet in Jerusalem after all the commotion of the previous day. But the Gospels tell us that the next morning, the day after the Sabbath, today is the Sabbath, Sabbath is Saturday, the improbable happened. Let's check it out together. Matthew 28. After the Sabbath, as the first light of the new week dawned, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to keep vigil at the tomb. Suddenly, the earth reeled and rocked under their feet as God's angel came down from heaven right there where they were standing. He rolled back the stone and then sat on it. Shafts of lightning blazed from him. His garments shimmered snow white. The guards at the tomb were scared to death. They were so frightened they couldn't move. The angel spoke to the women. There is nothing to fear here. I know you're looking for Jesus, the one they nailed to the cross. He is not here. He was raised just as he said. Come and look at the place he was placed. Now, get on your way quickly and tell his disciples, he's risen from the dead. He's going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. That's the message. The women, deep in wonder and full of joy, lost no time in leaving the tomb. They ran to tell the disciples. Then Jesus met them, stopping them in their tracks. Good morning, he said. They fell to their knees and embraced his feet and worshiped him. Jesus said, you're holding on to me for dear life. Don't be frightened like that. Go tell my brothers that they're to go to Galilee and that I'll meet them there. Meanwhile, the guards had scattered, but a few of them went into the city and told the high priest everything that had happened. They called a meeting of the religious leaders and came up with a plan, then took a large sum of money and gave it to the soldiers, bribing them to say, his disciples came in the night and stole the body while we were sleeping. They assured them, if the governor hears anything about your sleeping on duty, we will make sure you don't get blamed. The soldiers took the bribe and did as they were told. That story, cooked up in the Jewish High Council, is still going around. Meanwhile, yes, to this 2,000 years later, it's still going around. Meanwhile, the 11 disciples were on their way to Galilee, headed for the mountain Jesus had set up for their reunion. The moment they saw him, they worshipped him. Some, though, held back, not sure about worship, about risking themselves totally. Jesus, undeterred, went right on ahead and gave his charge. God authorized and commanded me to commission you. Go out and train everyone you meet far and near in this way of life, marking them by baptism in the threefold name, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Then instruct them in the practice of all I have commanded you. I'll be with you as you do this day after day, right up to the end of the age. There is so much happening in this story for me to pack into the next 10 minutes or so. There's the fact that the first people that Jesus appears to are women and not men. And if you know how misogynistic and patriarchal the society and the times in which the gospel stories were written, you know how unlikely it would be for them to admit that the first people who saw Jesus after his resurrection were women. Then there is the hilarious cover up by the high priest and the religious leaders, and the rumor that has persisted for thousands of years. But when it gets down to it, we cannot look away from the main thing that happened in the story. Jesus, who was killed and confirmed dead and buried, rose from the dead. As I said earlier, this is what distinguishes Christianity. This is not about teaching or resistance to a religious authority or oppressive authority or an enlightened social justice movement. This is a resurrection. And the resurrection forces a different kind of conversation than, say, the teachings of Jesus or even his death. There are lots of people that love and endorse the teachings of Jesus. They even co-opt them into their life and teaching. History is in agreement, not just the Bible, other writers write about this, other historians from the time write about the fact that Jesus was executed by the Romans at the request of the Jews, religious leaders. But there is contention about the resurrection story. Why is this? I think it is because the resurrection story demands a different response. My opinion is that the resurrection story requires or demands more than intellectual persuasion. In order to buy into the Jesus movement in its totality, you not only have to accept the origin story, the teachings of Jesus, his death, but also his resurrection. And in order to do this, what is demanded of you to believe a resurrection story is a leap of faith. The resurrection story calls us from what we know, out of what we know, into the great unknown. And this journey into the unknown is very simply a leap, which is why we have the expression in our cultural zeitgeist about faith being a leap. Take a look at the end of the section of verse 16 to 17. It says this: some, though, held back, not sure about worship, about risking themselves totally. It makes sense that there were those among the group that could not make the leap that the others could. Standing right in front of them was Jesus himself, the one they saw dragged off and get killed, and they still refused to believe it. They just couldn't take the leap. In truth, that is the reason why we've gathered here today. On one hand, it is a celebration of a crazy story that lies at the core of the Jesus way, but on the other hand, it is an invitation into a leap. It is not an invitation into an acknowledgement. No, it is an invitation into a way of being that is sparked into existence by the resurrection of Christ. And this way of being, this relationship, this life starts with a leap, because there is so much about Jesus that defies logic. When you really get into it, there's so much about Jesus that is upside down. There's so much about Jesus that challenges the established order of things. And in order to fully experience the beauty and the power and the restoration and the healing of this way that he calls us to, you have to leap out of what you know into the great unknown. Here's the thing. On one hand, you can look at Jesus on the cross, and you can see a prophet who was crushed by the religious aristocracy of the time. Or on the other hand, you can look at the cross and you can see that in one upside down act, Jesus is satisfying once and for all the penalty of sin for all of man, for all of time. Similarly, you can look at the resurrection story and you can see it as a barely believable recollection of historical events. You can look at the people who willingly laid down their lives because of what they saw and dismiss it as being as them being no different than other deluded religious martyrs in history. On the other hand, you can look at what's happening with eyes of faith and see that in the resurrection of Jesus, he breaks the curse of sin. And he shows us that when we die to ourselves, we can resurrect as completely different people, no longer under the slavery of sin, of fear, of judgment, and of condemnation. The resurrection provokes a conversation. The resurrection demands a response. The resurrection is an invitation into a leap of faith. And it is into this leap that I invite you this afternoon. On this April 15th, 2017, I boldly ask that you leap with me. I'll be honest, my faith does not come to me easily. It requires that I leap every day. It requires that I walk past what I can empirically define and jump right into a life and a way of being that only comes when I abandon the known and respond to the call into the unknown. Jesus rose from the dead. What's your response?